Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the US Futures weekly chart analysis for the week ending 12th of December 2025. The first chart is the US dollar index futures. They closed lower this week. Importantly, price broke below previous support and also below the previous bar's low. So this was a move lower here, and it may see this market just push down towards the next lower level here over time. Volume was increased, but it was contract rollover this week. That's that symbol down there. And I expect it would have been modest volume otherwise. The close below the previous support here is possibly significant, and we'll see the market drift lower over time, at least in the near term. Next chart is the E-mini S&P. This is S&P 500 index futures. They pretty much traded sideways in consolidation mode this week. There was no real intent being shown by the market. Price was up a little higher earlier in the week and drifted lower towards the end of the week. The market's effectively trading in consolidation mode in response to this up bar here, which is kind of forming a reversal over these two bars. The close above that bar's high is completing the reversal, and since then you've had two bars of consolidation right up high in this up bar's range, which is generally a fairly positive response and should see the market attempt to push higher when trading conditions are favourable. This is US Treasury 10-year note futures. They closed lower this week and returned to the lows of the range. This is previous support in here. There was no real intent being shown. Volume was about the average. Spread narrowed, so there was an element of support in there, and the close was right at the important level. This market's showing you that there's an attempt to support the market here. It doesn't really want to go lower. If it does so, the next lower level is obviously down here. But at this point, there's an attempt to defend against supply and hold on at these lows. This is copper price futures. And copper price futures closed lower this week, but within the range of the previous bar. This was an attempt to break out up here. The market's trading in consolidation mode. It's closed pretty much right at the 50% level of this up bar and remains in the upper portion of the two bars that combined formed an attempt to break out. Price closed comfortably within that level. Volume was slightly above average. It was reduced, but slightly above average. So you can see that volume increased as price was pushing out and above the highs of the range. And then volume has reduced as prices come back in consolidation mode, which is pretty much exactly what you'd like to see in a market that's showing some strength. Gold price futures. Gold price futures pushed above the previous up bar's high this week after 1 week of consolidation or testing for supply, and price has pushed up. It's closed a little off its high, so there was some supply being drawn out of this market. Volume was, however, while it was increased, it remained below the average. So there's no great intent being shown here. Demand is outweighing supply and price is floating higher, mostly on the back of a lack of selling pressure. You may, in response, see some testing for supply early next week, similar to this bar, and with perhaps a push higher later in the week if supplies prove to be low. Silver price futures, a little similar to gold in some respects, apart from a bit more volatility. Price pushed higher this week with a little bit more intent than gold, but it did close off the week's high, suggesting that supply was being drawn out. I expected some testing for supply in response to this bar, and all we really got was 1 day of trading below the previous bar's close before the market attempted to push higher. There's real urgency in this market at the moment. It's attempting to push higher. There is supply being drawn out, and it's blasting its way higher. It's generally not a sustainable way of moving higher in most markets, but this market's showing some serious strength at the moment. And despite the supply that's being drawn out, that supply is being absorbed by the buyers, and it's just ramming itself higher. I guess at some point it's going to come back and have to consolidate properly, but at this point demand is really strong. And that can be seen by these increasing volumes. Volumes are quite high, and the buyers are overwhelming the sellers at the moment. Light crude price futures just drifted lower on relatively low volume and down to previous support. This market's looking weaker than stronger at the moment, although it has been trading roughly sideways for quite some time now. You've got a sideways action pretty much from here. Volume was reduced and slightly below the average, so it doesn't appear that selling pressure is really overwhelming. Demand is low and price is just drifting lower in response. Into the currencies now. This is the Euro-US dollar currency pair. Price pushed higher this week, mostly due to the weakness in the US dollar. The very high volume is because of contract rollover. Price pushed up. It didn't seem too badly affected by the anticipated supply being drawn out to the left here. Price hasn't really closed much off its high for the week. So that was a pretty good effort, really. If you compare that to the pound, which closed off its high much more than the euro, you can see that there was supply being drawn out in this market. These two markets trade very similarly. Fundamentals play some part, but they trade very similarly. The inverse to the US dollar. You can see in this market, spread perhaps narrowed a little more than in the euro, and the close was a little off its high, perhaps almost mid-bar in here. Volume was similarly high and affected by contract rollover. So the euro is a little stronger this week than the pound, but both closed above the resistance level that was just above them last week. So that's a pretty good effort. Always difficult to push through those levels, and both have done so this week. Japanese yen currency futures, and they closed lower this week, despite the fact that the US dollar was lower. This market really is weak at the moment. We suggested that last week, that it was going to be very difficult for it to even challenge this level, the previous breakdown line, and it didn't do so this week at all. It's really drifted lower on relatively low volumes. This is contract rollover, so this probably would have been a modest bar of average size or less. Price continues to trade within the range of this down bar. The two up bars in response were fairly weak, and prices just drifted lower this week on a lack of activity overall. There's no intent being shown in this market at this point in time, and the weakness has really set in. All the recent up bars have shown signs of weakness, and at this stage there's very little signs of strength in this market. Aussie dollar currency futures, they pushed higher this week in response to the weakness in the US dollar, and I said last week it was going to be difficult for the market to push above this level. It's going to be possible. It's just a little more difficult, and that's what the market found. It did attempt to push higher. There was a little test for supply early, which is generally what you do see. There was an attempt to push higher. Price ended up getting pushed back to this resistance level. Volume was increased and well above the average, but once again it was contract rollover, so it would have been considerably lower, possibly at this sort of level. Spread narrowed this week, which reflects the difficulty in pushing above levels like this, the highs of the range here. Always going to be a difficult level to crack, and it may have another go next week, we'll see. But at this point in time, it's just struggling to push above that level, has to absorb supply and wait for that supply to be removed one way or the other before it can really push higher with relative ease. Bitcoin futures. Bitcoin futures continue to trade in consolidation mode following this breakdown here. Price is attempting to consolidate in this range here where price has consolidated in the past here. So it's attempting to emulate that to some extent. And you've seen a good response where this down bar found support at the important level. There was an up bar in response showing you that there was some buying support in the market. This was a test for supply and consolidation in the top half of the bar. Price pushed up and drifted lower in absorption style here. And you'd probably expect to see something like this in response. In a normal market, Bitcoin is not always normal, but something like that in response would be exactly what you would expect in a market that's consolidating. I don't think this market's in any position to really accelerate higher, or if it was, I expect a push higher would be sold into, so it'd be very difficult for the market to sustain a strong push higher. You may get a minor push higher and a drift lower, similar to this bar, but at this point in time, the market really needs to spend some time in consolidation mode, sort of like this over here. It was quite a number of weeks of consolidation sideways, and the market needs to do something like that over here before it can really attempt to push higher. What it really needs to do is build up some strength and not break down any further. So we'll just see how the market goes here. I expect it to continue trading in consolidation mode for a little bit longer yet. Back to the US dollar index futures just quickly. Price did break below previous support here, below the low of the previous bar. Both they suggest that the market is going to probably drift lower here. There'll be some little attempts to push higher along the way. It's not likely the market's going to reverse immediately, and at this stage, unless some strength is shown, I expect the market will probably come back to that level and test it for strength. Maybe that'll be over time. I don't think it'll necessarily be all in 1 week, but just over time, the price will drift lower and close just below the previous bar's low, as it did on this bar, as it did on this bar. You'll probably find a similar thing over the next few weeks with the market trading like this, and then perhaps test the market's strength at this level, something like that. Okay, thanks for your time. Now, I may or may not be producing weekly charts next weekend. I have a number of Christmas parties to attend to on Friday and Saturday next week, so if I do put something together, it may only be a partial set of charts, and it'll probably be on the Sunday at best. And if not, I'll put something together over the Christmas, New Year's break. I generally don't always produce charts during that period, but if I can't put anything together next week, I'll attempt to do so during Christmas and New Year's, that break in between. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to all the followers. Thank you very much. See ya.